My name is Steve Yulee. I'm the Vice President at the Institute for 21st Century Energy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to the side event today, Business Engagement in INDCs and Implementing the Paris Agreement. I'm glad we have such a good crowd here today, seeing that it's the last day of the COP, and I imagine a lot of people are heading out. So we welcome you, we appreciate your attendance, and we hope that you'll learn quite a bit from our event today. Let me just tell you a little bit something about the Major Economies Business Forum. This all started in February, the February before COP15 in Copenhagen. Dansk Industry held a meeting. We're talking business associations we have here pretty much matches the group of governments that are Major Economies Forum that was started under President Bush and continued under President Obama. We thought it would be a good idea to get to formalize this organization. And so now we have a coalition of developing and emerging groups, cross-sectoral business groups. I want to emphasize that. And you can see from the screen, we have well over 20 business groups that are part of our coalition. And our job really is to promote dialogue and exchange views, highlight areas of agreement among the participating business organizations, and to share these views with the governments, and more importantly, in this context, is to share our views with the UNFCCC, which is certainly something that we're very, very interested in. So I'm not going to talk too much longer because I want to get to our panelists. So the first speaker we have is from the U.S. Council for International Business. Oh, wait, I'm remiss in not saying we do have a website. It's called www.Major Economies Business Forum. That's all one word. It's a very long title, I'm sorry. MajorEconomiesBusinessForum.org. And you can get all our issue papers there. We have material on the events that we've held and a listing of all the 20-plus organizations that are partners in our coalition. And I would remind everybody too that we have 4 issue papers that we prepared for the COP in Marrakesh, and those issue papers, as well as the report that Noreen Kennedy is going to describe, are available at the back of the room. We did 4 issue papers this year, one on transparency, one on greenhouse gas markets, one on perspectives on COP22, and the 4th on business engagement, which is something that we've been, business engagement with UNFCCC, which is something that we've been working on for quite some time. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Noreen Kennedy. She's from the U.S. Council of International Business. USCIB recently conducted a survey on business engagement in INDCs and issued a report, which is also on our website. And Noreen is going to give us an overview of the results of that report. So Noreen, you have 10 minutes. The clock starts now.
Yeah, I would be surprised if I even have 10 minutes of my voice. So I'm going to be very rapid. I have many more slides than I can speak to. But it's really a very simple idea and presentation. First, a word about the United States Council for International Business. We're a group that works in many UN forums and officially represents the US business community in consultation with the OECD or as part of the International Labor Organization. So it struck us as an interesting question, what kind of consultation is going into the preparation of the INDCs? Because this is a first experience that we're all having under the Paris Agreement, and we had our own experience in the United States, and we were very curious throughout all of the partner organizations of the Major Economies Business Forum, how it went for them, and then to think about what the learnings were and the opportunities were from that national experience to make the national experiences better, and also to be carried upward into the global assessment and facilitative dialogue and stocktake. So 4 parts to the presentation. I'm going to speak quickly. I'm going to move quickly. Some definitions and provisos, the report itself, some thoughts for this meeting and thereafter, and looking ahead. So first of all, what do we mean when we say business engagement? It's more than just action, although action is important. We're also talking about technical input and informing the policy deliberations that go on here. This is not a review of the INDCs from the standpoint of their performance, We're not trying to critique or grade the INDCs. This was a first-time experience. So it's just to kind of understand how it happened, and it happened in many different ways. And then business is very special and different from other stakeholders. We're not the various actors that are referred to in the Paris Agreement. So there are special expectations for business in the Paris Agreement, and we really feel that there's a need for distinct consideration in light of that. So this is the report, which, as Steve said, is at the back of the room. Some very simple questions about how business was involved in the NDC preparations, and then taking some lessons from that, both for other stakeholder groups, but also for the international process. Our methodology was very simple: ask questions, read NDCs, and then interview governments. And that's what we did with winding up our interviews with governments earlier in May. And then we put together this report that you have. We also had a workshop in Paris in September at the OECD, and had a further very useful discussion there, and with some new learnings, really, including what we hadn't really thought about before, which was what can NDCs do for the private sector. We had been looking at them from the standpoint of how they fit into this intergovernmental process, but it became clear from presentations and suggestions that there was also some important guidance and blueprint in the NDCs for the private sector. And we don't have time to get into that there, but just to say that this was a significant new area of learning for us. Engagement benefits that we found, that there is a sort of resilient, continuous engagement that fits well with the 5-year cycles, that it better reflects subnational efforts, it adds to transparency, and it provides useful information for the governments. And we stole an image, but with all credit to the World Resources Institute, about what this looked like, a kind of a continuous cycle of improvement. And we definitely see that this is very germane to the UNFCCC. I said earlier that there are established frameworks for consultation with business and other forums, and we see a lot of also models from those existing frameworks for the UNFCCC. This slide is the story of my life. This just really shows very rapidly the history of business engagement in the UNFCCC and how we've, over time, opened new entry points, and as the treaty has evolved, so has the opportunities to engage. But I think the takeaway here is, first of all, that none of the old ones ever go away, so we have layer upon layer now of different entry points and interactions. And we have a big question mark: what will happen with the Paris Agreement and entry into force? COP22 brings some very new realities. Of course, we all feel it. Time pressure to complete the outstanding business. The transparency framework has been described as kind of a Rubik's Cube. So where the inputs and outputs and the modalities are going to be resolved. But for business, not only is the substance of this important, but where can we fit in and where can we learn from the transparency framework? Certainly adaptation and resilience take on a new meaning in light of some recent election outcomes and other political changes. So having business involved, we think, is also important for COP22 and beyond, going back to that previous slide. But the fact remains, we're still using the old structures to respond to post-Paris tasks and realities. This slide is very much from the perspective of a business person trying to figure out where to fit in and navigate the current UNFCCC system as business and industry NGOs. Just to say that it's complicated, I imagine it would also be similarly complicated for a government person trying to figure out where to connect to the business community. The model we're suggesting is something a little bit different. I know this looks more complicated than the previous slide, but in fact it's not. And the important part is that all of these things are in communication with one another, and for the governments as well as for the business people. They know what your initial contact point is, and then you can connect with all the many continuously proliferating activities that are going forward, and also link with the national process. I will skip this one. This talks about what we see as important in building this interface, that it's transparent, that there's good governance, that it's synergistic with the action agenda. We're not trying to get a single business view, but a range of views, inclusive and self-resourced. And that's what we're going to start to try to develop ourselves. So I'm going to start to close because you hear my voice going, and my time is nearly up. We really see an opportunity going forward from COP22 to begin to perhaps start from the very practical point of the facilitative dialogue, and where business can actually inform that dialogue. We've heard many governments indicate that they're interested in involving stakeholders in business, so we want to take advantage of that and reflect that. And also, as I said earlier, that there are also some utilities for companies and groups of companies for the NDCs. So we hope that on the basis of our report, we'll be able to make recommendations to national governments as they strengthen their NDCs, and also to have some of this reflected in what happens next here in the international process. We definitely feel the clock has sped up, and we see this opportunity to build in now as the infrastructure is being designed. As an interim step, we will develop a process as BISMEF to inform the facilitative dialogues looking ahead to the global stocktake, and hopefully that will be successful enough to really demonstrate its value. And then we'll also be involved in an in-session workshop of the SBI on enhancing effective engagement of non-state actors in May 2017. I guess my last observation is we've had some really important things happen this year in terms of conclusions in the Montreal Protocol, Kigali Amendment, and with ICAO. And in both cases, those outcomes were made possible because business was at the table working very in a very collaborative way with governments. We hope that that's a kind of a model and a demonstration of what is possible when you work more closely with business in a recognized way. And we hope to continue to demonstrate that value in this process. Thank you very much.
Noreen, I think you deserve a round of applause just for getting through that with the way you feel. So thank you for that. I think one of the important points that you made was and sometimes we say things that the UNFCCC wants to hear, and sometimes we needs to hear. And I think sometimes those are two different things. So it's very valuable to have that input. So next, we go to some experiences with developing INDCs. I was going to speak on the U.S. experience, but it's very easy. There was no consultation with business when the U.S. INDC was created, so I'm giving you my presentation on the U.S., and now we'll take a listen to what's been happening in some other countries. So we have three speakers. The first from Turkey is Tenyeli Sambunka from TUSIAD, and he'll be talking about the experience in Turkey. From Austria, we have Dr. Walter Kern. He's the Director General of the Austrian Federal Economic Chamber. And from Sweden, directly to my left, we have Maria Fleming, Head of Unit Energy, Infrastructure and Environment, the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise. So each of you has about 10 minutes. So Tenyeli, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Steve. My name is Tenyeli Sambunka. I'm an expert on sectoral policies at TUSIAD. I specifically deal with climate change and energy issues. I will be now talking about our experience in Turkey during the process of INDC development and the following process. I would like to start with just brief figures regarding who we are and our representative power. As you can see from the graphs here, we have got quite a representative power, roughly 80% of the foreign trade and the 65% of the industrial production, which makes us a accountable partner in policymaking. We are also a member of the Coordination Board on Climate Change, which is basically a council that brings together the relevant ministries and the business on climate change policymaking. The development process of the INDC, how it happens, basically the INDC of Turkey was based on a projection study, like many others, which was based on assumptions of economic growth, energy demands, land management, GHG emissions, and the so far planned policy instruments. The projection study was under the supervision of the climate change, the Coordination Board of Climate Change, and it was coordinated by the Ministry of Environment and Urbanization. We took part in the discussions, not only in the discussions in the climate change coordination boards, but also within the working groups under this board. We've submitted our position papers, especially stressing on the importance of the accuracy of the assumptions, as well as the outlining the sectoral aspect of the policies to be developed afterwards the INDC. What was the INDC? Let me remind you. The blue line represents a business as usual scenario, and the green line basically says a 21% reduction from the GHG emissions in 2030. And when we look at the sectoral perspective, the INDC basically outlines some policy instruments and goals, but those goals, the only quantifiable goals were in the energy sector. The wind energy capacity, 16 gigawatts by 2030, solar capacity, 10 gigawatts by 2030, and reducing the electric loss and some other measures, as you can see here, on other sectors. When we look at the current policy instruments, we basically have a renewable energy law, which provides a feed-in tariff scheme to support the renewable electricity production. We also have some support schemes for energy efficiency measures in the industry. And apart from that, we also have some labeling and eco-design regulations. In the white goods industry, as well as the new buildings. Well, what is at stake? Taking into account the Turkish INDC and also the instruments I've mentioned so far, we see that there is a need of consistency, especially regarding the goals for the energy sector, because as I have mentioned, the wind capacity goal was defined as 16 gigawatts on the INDC, but we already know that it was actually mentioned as 20 gigawatts in the electricity market strategy paper. The same goes for the electricity loss goal. And also, we already knew that there is a goal of 20% reduction in the energy intensity. If I remember correctly, was for the 2020. This was mentioned in the industrial strategy paper, but we do not see it in the INDC. Meanwhile, as I have said, the projections in the INDC, GHG emission predictions in the INDC, was based on the mainly the economic growth assumptions, which was outlined in the development plan. It basically says around 7% growth per year, but when we look at the figures in the previous years, which is basically around 3 to 3.5%. So this may see that we see that this may not happen as projected. When we look at the instruments under discussion, the Ministry of Environment and Urbanization is currently discussing emissions trading scheme mainly, and a little bit of carbon tax within the Partnership for Market Readiness Program, which is supported by the World Bank. We also had a draft, sorry for the writing here, it's actually a draft energy efficiency action plan. This draft actually outlined an electricity tax and climate tax. And we also have a revised renewable support scheme. The feed-in tariff I've mentioned is now revised, and it is basically now based on a sort of tender scheme. Taking into account the discussions I've mentioned so far and the situation at stake, in TUSIAD, we've conducted this study, which is making an analysis on current and potential climate policy instruments in Turkey, namely the market-based instruments, command and control instruments, and disclosure instruments, all instruments basically in the literature, and also taking a look at the global practices, as well as the discussions in Turkey, what are the instruments in Turkey, how are they working so far, and etc., and what do we need. It also includes an economic impact analysis, specifically on a potential carbon tax in Turkey. That is to say, I mean, presumably, if a carbon tax happens in Turkey, what is going to be its economic impacts? Well, the results briefly says that a carbon tax, an additional carbon tax on energy goods would basically have a large economic impact on carbon-intense sectors, which are basically the current drivers of the growth. When we look at the emissions trading, on the other hand, we see that the infrastructure is not ready. We do have an MRV scheme in place, but it did not yet prove itself. As far as the carbon tax, when we go back to the carbon tax, the study also worked on a neutral carbon tax, which basically says not an additional tax, but a carbon tax and tax waivers at the same time on employment schemes. It's although less, but still has major effects on economy, again, especially on carbon-intense sectors. Well, our suggestion on the study was basically either an emissions trading scheme or a neutral carbon tax. It should be supported with non-market instruments, namely energy performance certificates and standards, renewable energy certificates, R&D and technology support mechanisms, and etc. Well, we do have a reformed renewable energy legislation, but it should be durable. And we also need a roadmap for energy efficiency goal, and we also need further liberalization on electricity and natural gas sector. Since I do not have much time, I will just go there very briefly. These are going to be our further areas of focus, namely energy sector projections in future and resource efficiency, circular economy, Industry 4.0, we've already worked on it, and food security. Thank you very much.
Daniele, thank you very much. Seems like you folks have done a lot of work on your INDC, so that's good to see. Next, we have Dr. Korn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't have others for their engagement and all the endeavors being undertaken by the different decision makers concerning climate change initiatives on international and national level. I think one clearly can see here at the COP22 how much and how big the engagement is by all the drivers of this necessary movement, and in order to fulfilling the targets set by the political decision makers. Firstly, I would say, I mean, the commitment is now very high. Cannot hear? The commitment, sorry, yeah. The commitment, firstly, of all the political decision makers is very high, and by today, many 130 countries have ratified the Paris Agreement, and this represents 80% of all the CO2 emissions worldwide. This is very important because we have really a commitment going on. This is the first step. The second step is there's a big sensibilization, not only among the political leaders in all the countries involved, but there's a sensibilization in all the strata of society. And this involves politics, civil society, media, and of course, businesses hand in hand with science and technology. This is very important, and this we can see also in Austria, that this big movement for which we are, I think, at the start still, in order to fulfill all the targets we have set for the 2020, for 2030, for 2050, and for the end of the century. Maybe all the activities planned are not maybe sufficient enough, but now commitment and again sensibilization is a great basis to work upon. I'm just coming from a briefing from our Minister of Environmental Affairs, heavily involved with his staff here at the negotiations, and he says it is a very encouraging COP22. He says we all feel that the momentum is being maintained. It's a working COP, and Austria is very much involved. And actually, speaking of business involvement, there's also a representative of the, beside of myself, a representative of the Federal Economic Chamber of Business Representation in Austria, and a representative of the Austrian Association of Federal Association of Industry here at COP22. Of course, also our colleague from Business Europe, which is the umbrella for many national industry associations. Austria, concerning INDCs, Austria, of course, as being part of the European Union, one of the 28 member states, is 100% committed to act jointly with the other member states. And I'm 100% convinced that Austria will fulfill the targets set by the European Union in this context, firstly by 2020, and then the targets for 2030. For example, a 40% cut in greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990 levels, at least a 27% share of renewable energy consumption, at least 27% energy savings compared with the business as usual scenario. We are 100% clear that we will fulfill and of course work towards these targets, and we will, I think, I'm sure, surpass the fulfillment of these targets. We of course, we have, as any country in the world, we have a legal framework for all that. We have a National Energy Efficiency Act, we have a National Climate Protection Law, we are of course part of the EU emission trading scheme with the 2030 target of 43% reduction compared to 25. And so we are very confident. So concerning the process, I have to say, we have not yet the INDC plan completed in Austria. We are moving, and one can say confidently that in Austria, all the parties concerned will be and are being involved in this process, but it is not, of course, finished yet, and we are still working on a so-called, as we call it, integrated energy and climate strategy. It is in elaboration, this climate strategy. I have to maybe add that in Austria, the chamber has legal membership. This means the chamber, the economic chamber, represents 100% of all the businesses in Austria. And within the chamber, we have to do the balance of interests. Within the chamber, of course, there are maybe sometimes even also conflicting interests. So we are one voice for the businesses in Austria. But in addition, we have different associations like the, as I mentioned, Federal Association of Industry. We are very much, as I also mentioned, involved at the European business level with Business Europe. Actually, the Director General of Business Europe is an Austrian, a friend of mine. We are very much involved in other business associations in Austria, like Eurochamber. So we have in Austria the so-called social partnership. This means trade unions, Chamber of Labor, Chamber of Agriculture are involved in any processes for decision-making in Austria. And of course, we have the government, we have the parliament with 5 parties involved. We have a strong Green Party. We have a strong Green movement, but even within the, I mean, the center stage parties, we have very much a green touch. So I'm confident that we will reach the targets. I can, of course, explore more of the about the setup of our intergovernmental, interparliamentary system. I am confident because I rely on the businesses and the business strengths. And we also, just as a symbolic matter, we have here a group booth of Austria, just at the green zone, with 25 companies involved. We have the Technical University of Vienna involved. So science and business go hand in hand, and politics and business go hand in hand, as our minister invited Austrian businesses to come, and we gladly accepted and organized this participation. And when you even only talk to these 25 participating Austrian companies here at the COP22, you get really the feeling that we are, I think, cutting edge in many technologies. I mean, just to mention, finalizing my preliminary comment is, we do out of the energy production in Austria, 70% in Austria for energy production, for electricity. For electricity, 70% is done by renewables, renewable energy, mainly hydro, then wind, and then biomass, and then solar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Horn. I was interested to hear you talk about the balance of opposing views within your organization. The Chamber has 300,000 members. We represent 3 million businesses, and our chief lobbyists like to say when 70% of Chamber members agree on something, that's a good day. So we understand what you go through, and it's awful difficult to make that balance act, but when you do get consensus, it makes it all the more powerful. So that's great presentation. So next, we're going to turn to hear about the experience of business in INDCs in Sweden, and we have Maria Fleming.
Thank you. I represent the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise, which is also a member federation of 50 different organizations stretching from the heavy industry to the service sector. And we also have this obstacle of balancing different views within our organization. So it's always an interesting job to find a common ground for our views. Sweden is, just like Austria, a member of the European Union, of course, and that is, we are under the European INDC. So maybe it's a bit boring to have 2 European countries here, because we have similar experience, I think, that the European INDC was put forward under the European policy discussion, which was more general. The European policy discussion, as a Swedish representative, it is much more difficult to affect the European policy discussion than it is actually to do the Swedish policy discussion. We work a lot through Business Europe, who is here as well today, of course, and we also try to affect the Swedish view within the Council in the European Union and our European parliamentarians, of course. But generally speaking, it's much more difficult to affect that. But when it comes to climate policy, maybe as a Swedish business representative, European policy is really important because it puts sort of a ground level for the policy in Sweden. The real main obstacle for us might be the Swedish ambitions, because Sweden is, I think I lost the, no, it's okay. The Swedish policy is much more ambitious than the European policy. So I think there is where we actually have our big discussion going on, whether this is feasible in Sweden, what will be the consequences for the competitiveness for business sectors, for example. So if you just look at the Swedish context right now, I think regardless of which government we have, the environmental engagement is very strong. Right now we have the Green Party in government, which of course affects the climate policies very much. Sweden has also a very good starting point when it comes to climate. We have hardly no emissions from our electricity generation or the heating sector within Sweden at all. So the big areas that actually remains and that we are discussing in Sweden right now, it's transportation and industrial emissions, also combined with agriculture emissions, of course. So I think 1/3 of our emissions come from transport and 1/3 from industry, and the rest is 1/3. And that also puts us in a different context than many other European countries, where actually emissions from the energy sector is predominant and is the issue that you are focusing on. Renewable energy policies in Sweden to invest in, for example, more wind power actually does not affect our climate emissions, because we only have 2% of our generation which has emissions. So it's a very different position. But still, Sweden wants to be very ambitious. For the non-trading sector, according to the effort sharing agreement that is now being under discussion in the European Union, we would lower our emissions for that sector with 40%, which is the highest possible you could get from the European Union. But the Swedish target that is being discussed to 2030 for the non-trading sector in the Swedish context, that's minus 63%. So we're always chopping up these processes in Sweden. And for the transport sector specifically, Sweden is discussing actually to lower our emissions around 70% to 2030, which is well, maybe I shouldn't say that officially, but I would say it's an almost impossible target to actually reach. So when it comes to our involvement, we have a very good discussion climate in the Swedish policy sector. We're often invited as experts in official investigations. We have a very formal process around hearings in Sweden, where all different stakeholders are invited to put forward their views. But that does not mean that the politicians or policymakers actually listen to us. So it's a big difference between being involved and actually being listened to and taking into account. So I think what we are focusing on in Sweden right now is trying to put forward how do we actually get some realism into the policy? How do we make the Swedish policy safeguard the competitiveness of the business sector? And what are the measures that actually will be put forward by the Swedish policymakers? Of course, the EU ETS is a very strong policy instrument in Sweden as well. And for those sectors under the EU ETS, that is the policy measure, which we have fighted very hard for not to have any additional policy instruments for that sector. That is a very important factor for us. But when it comes to the sectors outside the EU ETS, it is much more diverse. Sweden has, for example, a carbon tax, which we've had since the 90s, actually. Today, it is at a very high level. I looked at the latest World Bank assessment of carbon pricing, and I think the Swedish level is $137 per ton compared to the EU ETS, where you have around $6 per ton. So the Swedish policies are very strong in this regard. And now we're gradually phasing out the exemptions we've had for industries under this energy policy or this energy or carbon tax. So how to safeguard the competitiveness in a Swedish context is our main focus. And we try to be very much involved in this. I would say that the European INDC is not a problem from a Swedish context. I would say it's hard to be involved in those kind of processes. But we're trying to be involved in the European, but actually the main issue of discussion is around the Swedish implementation and the Swedish own targets that we are putting forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I thanked all the speakers because we finished ahead of schedule. But one thing that struck me, what Maria said, was that policymakers don't always listen to business. I know that's a newsflash for a lot of folks, but for those of us in the business community, we kind of live with this. This forum is establish a channel so that the business community can speak directly to the UNFCCC if they have questions. We have the expertise, we have which could be very valuable this process. That doesn't guarantee that they will use the information we give them, but we still think it's important to establish a channel so at least it gives us the opportunity to provide that information. All right, next to talk about business perspectives on the global INDC portfolio is Dr. Brian Flannery. He's the chair of the Business Working Group on Business Engagement. I imagine we'll hear a lot more about business engagement from you, Brian.
Well, perhaps. One thing I'd like to say is, I think Noreen mentioned early on, I think all of us were surprised by election results last week, but in doing our survey of how business interacted with INDC preparation, several governments have had turnover since they formulated their initial INDC. We believe that one of the advantages of business consultation is to provide some more continuity and expectations in that process, which I think will be, I've been doing this since 1980. Noreen's been doing this, many of us, for a long time. We, society, are going to be doing this for decades. Getting more continuity will be really important. You've heard some really good discussions of engagement, and the paper that Noreen described mentioned several others. We did a workshop at the OECD in September and had presentations from Europe, France, Japan, and Brazil. They're all different. But what you have are multi-sectoral business associations who do not represent renewable energy or nuclear power or whatever. We represent an interest in having a viable economy in our countries, and that's what we want to bring in part to this process. So that said, BISMAF is focusing on two aspects. One, engagement in domestic INDCs. In these meetings, we're often told you should talk to your government. Well, these are the people who do. Our associations are often the primary business interlocutors with government on many, many issues, not just climate. But we also believe we have perspectives on what the implications are of the global INDC portfolio, and that's what I'm going to speak to. So I really divide this up into a few areas. First, INDCs, and you heard this also from Tanyeli. What do we know and what don't we know? What wasn't explicit in the INDC that we need to know? But moreover, we need economy-wide perspectives. You cannot add up the sectoral approaches and say, here's what it means to the economy. Businesses are linked through supply and value chains. When you push on one sector, it often flows into another. I'm going to show a series of results from a particular tool and capability in Japan, the RITE, Research and Technologies for Earth Integrated Assessment Model. In the world, there may be a dozen groups who do integrated assessment modeling at a high level. I work with them. I've been a lead author in IPCC. These are the groups I work with extensively. I will say this is a great model. Don't believe the numbers. Don't believe the numbers in any of these, but believe the trends. They are tools that are set up to examine the connections domestically and internationally in the economy. More on that in a minute. And opportunities for business to inform the international processes, especially the ones they're developing that aren't yet complete, the rule book issues and the processes in transparency and the global stocktake. So we believe that business engagement can inform the formal and informal processes to review and renew INDCs and the challenges and opportunities to strengthen the Paris Agreement. And that's the case I wish to make today. So many INDCs, as Tanyeli said, do not provide clarity on the underlying assumptions about population, about economic growth or labor and productivity. Very importantly, by the time you get to 2030, what technologies will be available and what can be tapped into with price signals or other approaches, and even more if you go out to 2050. Policies to implement action. Many of the INDCs describe the target, but not the policies, or they're incomplete or inconsistent, and business has to put them all together. We don't get to work in silos. Most people in business are doing business. They aren't doing the UNFCCC. Metrics to evaluate outcomes. For the developed countries, the metric is pretty much an economy-wide inventory, and we've now got 20, 30 years experience with those. They're quite good. Still issues on land use and some other areas. But in many of the developing country INDCs, this isn't a criticism, but they're framed in terms of improvements with respect to business as usual or sectoral improvements. Well, we need to know what those are concretely and how they're doing in terms of a metric. And finally, BISMEF has made clear, we think there should be more clarity on the financial procedures and mechanisms. The least developed countries are being asked to form plans for long-term strategic response, and they're going to need financial aid. We're going to have to be more clear about it. And business operates in those countries. We'd like more clarity too. So we think that's something where there's common ground in some others. But this lack of understanding of the underpinning information hinders efforts to inform the transparency processes now, often described as ex-ante reviews of proposed policies, going forward, and future updates to INDCs. So these models are also used to inform the discussion on comparability of effort and potential consequences. And I think business has a lot of insight into that. I'm not sure we necessarily have answers, but I think in dialogue with the research scientists, the governments, and the business community to point out what looks to be an important issue to study, we can all help make better progress. So economy-wide and global interactions are ubiquitous in everyone's economy these days. Outcomes cannot be assessed sector by sector or without considering the entire global portfolio. IAMs, integrated assessment models, provide that capability. Now, they're not predictive with great certainty, but they are the tools that are being used. They're being used by academics, by research institutions, and many, many nations to inform themselves about what INDCs mean, not just their own, but those of others. This handful of modeling capabilities have been hired as consultants to almost all of the governments to begin to understand. And frankly, I think making this capability available to developing countries is going to be really important also for credibility. As well, business and governments have actually worked with this community to help them develop the research capability over decades. I've worked with groups at MIT and Pacific Northwest National Labs. The MIT program has 30 industrial sponsors. The people who interact with MIT are strategic planners, R&D managers, and people who work this in policy processes. So this information is widely available, although quite technical. And they will play a central role going forward as we address these issues. So to simulate economic and environmental outcomes resulting from INDCs, modelers simply have to fill in the blanks or they can't run the models. If the assumptions aren't explicit, they have to put them in. And knowing what they had to put in is really important to us to understand how these will really work. So I'm now going to show you 3 results from the, by the way, we will post these PowerPoints on the BISMEF website. So probably not today. If someone's really urgent, give me your card, we'll send it to you. I'm going to show you just a handful of results. I'm not going to go into them in detail. Look at the trends, not the numbers. So this is the emission reduction ratios in 2030 from a base year of 2005. After you put it in the model, you've got the numbers for every year you care to do, and you can put them all on a common basis. The US one only goes out to 2025, but you see emissions reductions of tens of percent in European nations and others, and emissions growth well over 100%, 200% in India, 180% in Turkey, 116% in China. It's a wide range of outcomes under the INDC. But even more, now I want to be clear, this is not the cost under the policies nations have assumed. The INDC model says, the IAM model says, let's impose a carbon tax in the domestic economy and achieve the outcome using a carbon tax, which is economically, in their terms, the most efficient way to achieve the outcome. So this isn't what really happens. What really happens with the policies that are in place probably has a bigger impact on the economy because it's less efficient. In Switzerland and Japan, to achieve their INDCs, the marginal abatement cost in 2030 would be nearly $400 a ton CO2. In the US, perhaps 80, in the EU, 200, in India and China, 0. This doesn't mean they're doing nothing, but progress under trends as usual in the IAM. They build a reference case with no policy and then they put in additional policy. It's their belief that those outcomes would be achieved without additional policies. It doesn't mean they're doing nothing, but the comparability is quite striking that we have a wide range of outcomes. Here's electricity prices delivered to households in the various countries. And you need to go into much more detail to see what the economic or competitiveness impact is. But you can see, again, electricity is a pretty ubiquitous input to everything we do, and the prices vary in countries. And now here's emissions pathways, which you've seen many, many times in this forum and others, showing emissions from 1990 to 2100. The dark black line is sort of the reference case in the IPCC and other analyses. The dashed line was the expectations before the Paris Agreement. And the dark red line is the emissions expectations under the Paris Agreement. The other lines go down to outcomes which translate, although we really don't know what the translation is, to various temperature outcomes. But with an IAM, you also can put economic factors into these, and I'm going to show you what they are under their assumptions. If you did an economy-wide carbon tax to achieve the Paris Agreement, it could be done at $6 a ton, because there's lots of opportunity in developing countries, but we're paying higher cost in developing countries. I'm not making any value judgment. I'm just saying there are opportunities to improve the economic efficiency. To get on to some of these pathways that might get us in the range 2 to 3 degrees, by 2050, the carbon tax, the CO2 tax would be about $70 a ton. In some nations, it's higher than that now, but in most nations, it doesn't exist. To get on track to below 2 degrees C, it would be about $300 a ton CO2 in 2050 with a global economy-wide carbon tax. What I'm saying is, at least in the models with the slate of technologies we have and the policies we have and the way we're trying to do it, these prices escalate very rapidly to achieve these outcomes. We can hope for technology breakthroughs and other effects to lower those costs, but they're large. And we need to recognize that when we set our strategies for how we go forward. But what insights can you get from these studies? Projections, ex-ante assessments. You learn a lot more about what assumptions and policies are that need to be supplied to the INDC. You can get some inkling of comparability of effort, but I think that requires a lot more discussion of just what the exact details are. And those then have implications for competitiveness, investment, and trade, and certainly the need to account for the economy-wide interactions. A business doesn't operate in its sector. It has suppliers and it has value chains, and it flows through that whole thing of supply chains. That's what affects the economy-wide outcome. I often like to say this process regards the sectors as one team and different teams. In the sector, they're your competitors. In the other sector, they're your suppliers and customers. And so it's a different relation than I think often the way people in this process sometimes think about how the sectors interact. And you absolutely need to account for global interactions and their potential consequences in trade, investment, and also wealth transfers that are implicit in these models once you look at what happened. How will that occur? What effect will it have? And then going forward, the ex post review. We have outcomes based on assumptions. Well, what if the world unfolds in a different way? If the assumptions don't hold, what are the effectiveness of policies? Are they going to deliver what you thought they were in making the INDC? And in terms of assumptions, the consequences of unforeseen events not in the plan, they always occur. Elections occur. Tsunamis occur that cause a shutdown of a nuclear fleet that have a huge impact on performance, or unanticipated technology change, like frack gas and fracked oil, weren't in the plans of people having these discussions years ago. So these are things we think need to be accounted for. We believe that business perspectives can make key contributions to inform domestic and global assessments. And I want to be clear, I'm not sure we know the answers, but in dialogue with the academics and the researchers and the governments, we can learn what we need to know better. That said, in terms of business engagement, going forward, we in the Major Economies Forum, we intend to organize and contribute to workshops and other efforts to help understand domestic and international progress under the Paris Agreement, such as the one we did at the OECD and one we did this past Sunday at this event. And we will engage with business, governments, the UNFCCC, academic and research institutes in dialogues to inform and complement the formal transparency processes to assess INDCs and take stock of collective action. We hope we can have channels into the formal processes too, but we will engage in dialogue along the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but a similar presentation you gave at the OECD workshop, it was similar to this, yeah?
Yes, quite similar, but
Okay.
trying to make it shorter and
No,
more
I'm
concise.
just saying, so if people want to get Brian's presentation, he does have that presentation from the OECD workshop on the BISMED website. Go to the events page. And look at the events PowerPoint, not the others, but we will get the others posted to the website as soon as we can. And a couple of things Brian said, it was very the models, they don't give you answers. I think anybody knows who's dealt with models at any length of time knows that whatever model spits out is going to be wrong. We know that from the outset. So models don't give you answers, but they do give you insights, and the insights can be very, very valuable as this process goes along. And something Brian also said, and Taniele said about no clarity in some of the INDCs. The US INDC, believe it or not, doesn't even mention the word industry. The word industry is not in the US INDC. So if you're a business organization like the Chamber, you're asking yourself, well, where does industry fit in into all this? Obviously, the policies that the U.S. government has in place aren't going to get to the 26 to 28% Paris pledge that President Obama made. So what does this mean for industry? And the INDC didn't provide any clarity of that at all. We're as much in the dark as everybody else. So just a very good point that I think a couple of the speakers made. So do you think we should ask questions while you're up here? Do you want to spend a few minutes to take questions from the audience, or
I'm looking at some of the people who are going to speak, and they're saying take questions now, but I want to be sure we get our comments from some of our respondents.
business people that were involved as well as governments was that there was different kinds of consultations, and it wasn't necessarily always only with the main multi-sectoral group, but that in several countries there was also outreach to specific sectoral groups or even individual companies. So, okay, I'm pleased to.
Well, my views are actually to my colleague from Sweden. And well, actually different from you, I do not see that as a really a problem because like my Swedish counterpart pointed out, I mean, we represent we basically are working for the whole economy. And when we look at our membership composition, well, we've got a quite large variety of members from totally different sectors. I mean, we've got wind energy producers, on the other hand, also representing coal sector, I mean, cement producers, iron and steel. So we've got a whole bunch of different interests and views, of course, but we are trying to bring them together and come out with a compromise, which was actually quite hard within our study, but we, as far as I see, we accomplished that. So, I mean, and also on the other hand, we do have Wind Energy Producers Association in Turkey, and as well as the solars, and we do interact with them, and we are happy to get their views actually.
For Austria, I can say, I mean, first of all, as I mentioned, I mean, there's a lot of sensibilization going on in Austria right now towards renewables, green energy, environmental technology. So many years ago, there was only the green movement advocating for these targets, but now it is a quite a very general sentiment in Austria. So it's a shift towards a very positive sentiment. Speaking of the, I mean, businesses, I can say that the businesses, I mean, covering environmental technology, renewable technology, electromobility technology, energy efficiency, technologies in construction and so on, smart city concept, smart grid concept. This total business sector is growing much faster than the overall businesses in Austria. So just to give you two figures, overall industry grew in the last 5 years per 2%, and the environmental technology industry grew by 18% in the last 5 years. So even there's a push from businesses. I mean, as they see, I mean, the R&D percentage within the environmental technology sector is much higher than in the overall businesses. So R&D driving, employment driving, I mean, increasing much further. Even, for example, foreign trade in this part is in this sector is much higher. The percentage-wise, the increase. So there's a positive sentiment. Of course, there's, I mean, we have quite a big share of industry within the GDP. I see it as an asset, as a real advantage, but at the same time, of course, for the energy intensive industries is a challenge, like steel industry, cement industry, paper industry, which are also strong in Austria, is a challenge. But I think we can tackle all these challenges with the technologies. I mean, the one is the policy setting, and we can set targets and we can bargain concerning the targets. But the other thing is, I mean, the driving force, in my opinion, is the business and the technology driving force. I mean, business together with science. We have, I mean, not as good as Switzerland yet, but we have a more than 3% R&D quota in Austria, with also targeting towards 4%. So I'm confident from this point of view. I mean, again, the politicians and the parliament, of course, they have to set a rule and we have to put into paper all the action plans. We will do that. But the real driving force, again, is the technology driven businesses.
Great, thank
Steve,
you.
Steve, just a quick comment.
Okay.
You can see our business group here. Wide range of views. I don't see that as a problem. That's the real world of business, and everybody has strong interests and stakes. I think everybody's trying to find ways forward, and you certainly need cement and steel to erect a windmill. So I don't see it as a problem. It is a fact of life, just as here in these negotiations, the nations have widely different views, and sometimes the views of particular nations change from one election to the next. It's the way things are. I think what's important is to work respectfully and bring real information into this process, and that's what we try to do.
Brian, I was going to make the same point that you made, and we just brought CGEM, which is the Confederation of Moroccan Enterprise, on board BUSINESS. They've been great hosts. They held a business summit just a couple of evenings ago and put out the Marrakesh Declaration. So they've been very, very active. We're very proud to have them join BISMET. But Brian's right. We have a broad range of views within BISMEF alone, and so we have to balance that as well. But if we go at it respectfully, as Brian said, honestly, we get good results, and we usually wind up with a consensus view. And when we don't wind up with a consensus view, we're more than happy to publish two opposing views because we think it's important for policymakers to understand that there are opposing views in the business community. So with that, why don't we thank our panelists, and we'll bring up the group of respondents. Are you sure?
Different list.
Huh? Okay. Okay. We have our panelists of respondents. We have one panelist scheduled, Russell Miles from Australia. He can't make it. But we are joined by two experts who will give us their views. First, Kazuhiko Hambu. He's a professor at the University of Tokyo. He's the former chief negotiator for the government of Japan, METI. I've known Hambu-san for many, many years from my previous experience working with the Department of Energy in the U.S. government. You'll want to listen to what he has to say. He's very knowledgeable and very insightful about these issues. And we also have with us John Scowcroft, who's with the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Initiative. A lot of people have said, and I think it's true, you're not going to be able to reduce emissions significantly unless you get carbon capture and storage in train. So we'll be very interested to hear what we have to say. But why don't we start with Mr. Hambu?
Thank you very much, Yuzo-san. I'm the first? Okay, the time is quite limited. I would like to make my comments very short and precise. And as he introduced me, I was the former energy policy maker and also the negotiator of these sessions before Copenhagen. And this session makes my comment on the business engagement in Japanese target setting on INDC and the engagement, how to implement the Paris Agreement also. And through my long experience in METI, he introduced and on energy environmental policy making and enforcement, especially on making long-term energy supply and demand plan. I think, as I can say, Japan is a country that uses the views of industry and business sector most effectively, I believe. The typical example is the Keidanren Action Plan on the environment that is shown in the report made by you and also introduced by Norin-san. This action plan is made up by more than 60 different types of industry and business sectors. Some of them are emitters, some of them are green industries, but more than 60 members are sitting together to making this action plan on Cadence land. From manufacturers, energy producers, transportation sectors, retail seller, and financial sectors. And by using a bottom-up approach, namely, I believe this is so-called self-determined action plan by business sector. The action plan itself is determined, as I said right now, by piling up the maximum and practically achievable, this is quite important, practical achievable effort determined by each industry and business sector, such as present INDCs and the Paris Agreement. Past and long experiences since 1997, just as after we agreed the Kyoto Protocol in here under this negotiation, were very important and very helpful for deciding and setting up the present Japanese INDC, I believe. Having said so, I believe also the most important experience of the action plan is sharing the past and also present actions and their effectiveness and efficiency together with the detailed information. And I firmly believe this Japanese experience and Japanese business sector's experience will be helpful for designing and applying the facilitative PDCA cycle of the Paris Agreement for new NDC setting based on the outcomes of the global stock taking of different kinds of information collecting through the coming transparency mechanism we are discussing right now, but no agreement right now. It's a very tough negotiation, but after we reach the agreement on transparency mechanism, our experience on the business participation for implementing stage will be very helpful for our global society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And for those interested in the back, we do have a BISMEF paper on just the issue Hambu-san was talking about, transparency. So we encourage you to take a look at that. And one thing he said, he talked about goals should be practical and achievable. Business doesn't expect certainty, but we do expect predictability to come out of the process. And if something's not achievable and something's not practical, it's therefore not predictable. So I think that's a very important point that he made. And next, we're going to turn to John.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everybody. John Scowcroft, I work with the Global CCS Institute. I've been following this process nearly as long as Brian has. But what I'd like to do today is to talk a bit how the Institute actually responded to the INDCs. My first disclaimer is that no governments consulted us over the INDCs, although just to introduce the Institute briefly, we are an international membership organization with offices in Washington, Tokyo, Beijing, Brussels, with a head office in Melbourne. And our membership, if I look at the members of BISMEF, some of your members are our members and some of your members are our members. The difference is that we also have government in membership. So we are a strange sort of beast to be sitting on this platform. Nevertheless, when we saw the INDCs coming, we decided really we would look at them from the point of view of the objective of the Institute, which is the accelerating the deployment of CCS, and to see what we could do. Now, we have developed a number of tools over the years of the Institute. We have a legal and regulatory policy index, which looks at how prepared various countries are from a legal regulatory point of view to implement CCS. We also have a storage atlas. So we took those and we also looked at various countries' energy endowment, and then we read the INDCs, and my colleague Mark and I spent an awful lot of time reading INDCs. And what we discovered was, in fact, that there are 10 INDCs which cite CCS as part of their policy. That actually covers some 30%, over 30% of global emissions. We then looked at various other documents, the technical needs assessments, for example, that come out of the tech, and we identified a few others. And then, of course, there are quite a significant number of INDCs which do not mention CCS from countries who we know are deploying it. So I think overall we sort of came to the conclusion that about 70% of global emissions were covered by countries using CCS. What do we do next? Well, we then looked at all those and from the regulatory point of view and tried to identify those who we thought really we could help and reach out to help them to get in their next in their NDCs. But after all, looking at the INDCs, they only cover most point up to 2025. And if you're looking at the deployment of CCS, 2025 is pretty much sort of tomorrow. So what we're really looking forward to is influencing the next round of NDCs, when if you look at what IPCC and everyone else is saying, is you're not going to get to the 2% without deploying CCS. So in a sense, we are looking forward to the next round of NDCs, and we hope to be able to play a part in talking to governments and to business about that. And I think in the interest of time, I'll finish there.
Thanks, John. That's a great strategy. I was with the Bush administration many, many years ago, and we started the Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum, which was pretty much a talk shop. But I will say this about the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. It's a do tank. It's not a think tank. It's a do tank. They do excellent work. And really, you should visit their webpage. They're doing some great stuff. So we do have a few minutes. We have about 5 minutes left for Q&A. If anybody in the audience would like to ask our panelists a question, or if you want to ask a question of any of the other speakers, I think they would probably be able to oblige.
Hello, my name is Austin, and I'm from the Brown Climate and Development Lab. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more on to what degree multinational companies can be held accountable to NDCs, and whether or not we can make sure that we are accounting for all their actions across the globe.
Who wants to take that?
Probably I have to make a comment on these issues. Yes, how the global supply chain affect the global distribution of emissions are very tough issues. And apparently this UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, national-based commitment and national-based action. But through the first cycle of the implementing stage and new INDC setting, we are clearly facing that issues. Right now, after year 2000, Chinese emission grows quite rapidly, far more than the EU 28 emission, total emission. That is because the global manufacturing center is located in China. So Chinese issue is the global issues, but it's a very political issues that doesn't want to affect it by any outside of the comments by the Chinese government. So the first facilitative action and facilitative PDCS cycle is quite important for succeeding the implementing stage of this Paris Agreement. That is my personal point of view. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Questions? I see none. So thank you very much for coming today. Please visit us on our website, www.majoreconomiesbusinessforum.org. You can even try www.bismeth.org. It's a lot shorter. It'll save your fingers. And we thank you for joining with us, and we hope you all have a pleasant and safe trip home.
I took quite a few. Yeah. I'll send it to you in an email.